Clearly there's a lot to probe and discuss. We've got one final perspective, and I'm very pleased to say it's a question of bringing it home, so to speak. Professor Yeatman, it was a great day. It was a very good day, the day that Anna agreed to become the inaugural Professorial Research Fellow for the Whitlam Institute, heading up our Human Rights and Public Life program and ensuring, I think, that both the rigour and the intellectual endeavour that's brought to public policy within our own work is taken to a whole new level. So it's been a great privilege for us, and it'll be a great privilege for you, I'm sure, to hear Anna speak this evening.
Thank you, Eric. I'm still battling a virus, so I'll be sucking my fisherman's friends. Well, what I have to offer is very much in the spirit of learning to practice public conversation, and I'm deliberately doing this. I don't think I know how to. I don't really know what method I should pursue, but nevertheless I've committed myself to finding out through practice, and I invite you to do the same. What I want to talk about is the degradation of decision-making in public and private agencies at this time. I believe that we are living in a culture of decision-making that's oriented to the short term and within very narrow horizons. And let me give you three different examples. First of all, John Hewson, an economics and investment expert, is working with the Climate Institute on an initiative called the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, which scrutinises where the world's financial powerhouses invest their money. And this project is focusing on the top 1,000 pension and superannuation funds, endowment funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies. And the question is, and it will be of concern to all of you who have superannuation, is whether these funds are making decisions that mitigate their risk of exposure to catastrophic climate change. So far, apparently, many funds have responded negatively to the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, pushing back the drive for greater transparency on their climate-exposed investments. John Hewson says of the Future Fund here in Australia, quote, "It manages about $80 billion worth of funds. They spend about $1.2 billion a year on managing that. Their response to us was they don't have the resources to adequately manage climate risk." So that's the first example. The second example is that of a major Australian public hospital that recently took the decision to contract out all its cleaning and waste management services to an overseas headquartered and owned global company. The hospital signed a contract with the company for 28 years. The decision represents a major shift in the hospital's practice away from employing continuing workers in these areas to reliance on a firm that uses private contractors who in turn use casual workers. The hospital's made the decision because, I presume, it's required to operate more efficiently, to do more with less. As a result of the decision, the global company has extended its market share in the service sector within Australia, and it is entirely possible that this local decision belongs to a pattern of such decision-making. The change in the nature of employment in this hospital has contributed to the increase of precarious work in Australia, and finally the decision has altered the day-to-day functioning of the hospital, casual workers being far less likely than continuing workers to become incorporated into the relational ecology of care of the hospital. My third example. In Australia, 457 visas, and some of you will know a lot about this, is a government program for bringing non-Australians to work in Australia after being sponsored by an Australian or overseas employer. Now, the program itself is stratified, and it includes a seasonal worker program where, quote, "only citizens of East Timor, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, who are sponsored by an employer as seasonal workers, can work in Australia for 14 weeks to 6 months. I've taken this all from the official website of the Australian government. As far as I can tell, all the risks are borne by the workers. They have to pay a visa application charge, and I would bet that they're paying recruitment of agencies. create the channel through which they come. They have to meet all their living costs during their stay, and they have to maintain private health cover during their stay. And they cannot bring their dependents with them. Now, clearly, the money they earn will mostly go back to their source countries, and it's impossible for me to imagine that the governments of these countries are not in some way implicated in this program, if only in respect of their dependence on taxing the remittances sent back. Let me add here, as you will know, that most of these countries are vulnerable to the impact of global warming on rising sea levels. Now, I think this could be a good program that responded to the needs of all the stakeholders in a publicly accountable way, but that's not how, as far as I can see, it's currently functioning. Currently, the Australian government seems to be permitting the private interest of employers to drive the program. Well, what do these examples have in common? I think there's nothing holding the relevant decision makers to account to the public interest. Now, what is the public interest? That is something we need to practice public conversation about. But one thing seems obvious. I don't think the public interest is short-term. It concerns the integrity of a society as it persists over time. And today, the integrity of one society implicates the integrity of other societies, so that local solutions must have a global horizon. Well, let me continue describing the problem as I see it. Staying focused on this degradation of decision-making. People are more educated than ever before and have far more access to good quality information. So why then is their decision-making so poor in quality? And I want to describe now the model that I think has taken over all organisations, public and private. It has the following features: a culture of top-down and executive style or prerogative decision-making. Decision-making is not collaborative, it does not involve stakeholders, and it is not politically accountable to a wider public. Secondly, it's informed by sophisticated mathematical modelling, where the things that have to be considered are reduced to quantifiable variables and calculation. Now, such techniques are sometimes very important to use, so I'm not saying they should never be used, but when reliance on them takes over the culture of decision-making, then more complex decisions that require human beings to face each other in talking about how to weigh risk in relation to potential consequence are avoided. Decision makers prioritise short-term and measurable organisational success over all other considerations. Decision makers refuse responsibility for addressing the institutional, organisational and policy environment in which they work. They're like rats, with their attention focused entirely on success within the maze. They don't question the design of the maze itself. Decision makers avoid public conversation and accountability because in truth it's hard for them to explain their decisions to an audience that requires plain language, consideration of unintended consequences, and of long-term social and environmental impact. Further, as individuals with personal agendas, decision makers make short-term commitments to the organisation within contractual arrangements that reward them handsomely for short-term success. They purvey the fiction that good management is context indifferent, a fiction that justifies perpetual personal career-oriented moves from one organisation to another. And finally, decision makers treat the humans who are required to carry out decisions as instruments of the organisation. And here they're very good democrats because they start with themselves. They allow themselves to be used by the organisation. They go to the gym so that they function more efficiently, and they work long hours at the expense of family and friends and of their own inner life. They become finely tuned, highly skilled, and efficient instruments of their organisation, but in the process they lose, if they ever developed, the capacity to think and judge for themselves. They become wary of public intellectuals who address the political ethical questions of our time, and they exclude these intellectuals from the processes of decision-making. This means also that public intellectuals lose connection with the practical demands of decision-making and end up themselves offering a different kind of abstraction. Well, this degradation of decision-making, in my view, is systemic. It characterises both public and private sectors. But we can't treat these two sectors as though they're on an equal footing. They're designed to do different things. The public sector is designed to address collective problems in a lawful, publicly accountable way. The private sector is designed to address private strategies for wealth accumulation. And there's the so-called third sector, of course, which is very important, but which I believe takes on the colour of whichever of the public or private sectors is dominant. The public sector should offer leadership for the private sector on all matters, where how the private sector operates is of consequence for our collective life, for the public interest. And that point used to be well understood. For instance, it was one of the arguments for a mixed economy where the role of government was to demand of private enterprise that it serve important values, public values. When government's permitted to assume authoritative power of this kind, it pulls the decision-making of private organisations into a prudential, collaborative, long-term and publicly accountable ethos of decision-making. Now, I agree that short-termism has been fostered by the doctrine, the ideology of neoliberalism. In that ideology, the only value that is recognised is that of efficiency, and efficiency by its nature is short-termism. Moreover, it's neoliberalism that inverts what should be the normal, the proper relationship between public and private. Instead of government holding privately interested organisations to public account, privately interested organisations treat government as though its only reason for existing is to serve them. But the reason I focused on decision-making and decision-makers is that while I do think neoliberalism is the primary culprit, somehow we have to start with us. Those of us who are decision-makers or who relate to decision-makers. And I'm wondering whether the kind of civil disobedience that's been raised might take the form of a constructive questioning of our decision-makers in the organisational settings within which we dwell. We know these people. Some of us are these people. That's where I'm coming from. And while I think people can tell themselves all sorts of stories justifying what they're doing, we have to bring all these people into a shared public conversation and to ask them whether they continue to believe those entirely crazy stories, in a sense, when they begin to think or are asked to think. So what to do? I think we have to find ways of refusing short-termism. Each one of us has to figure out what we can do to retrieve and renew an ethos of good decision-making in our organisations. We have to rebuild the language and concept of the public interest, of the public sector, and of the state as the public authority, and find a way to do that lands. How do you talk to the neighbours in your street and introduce them to the idea of the public interest? That's the kind of thing that I'm interested in talking about. They already recognise it in many respects, so how do you tease out that conversation? How do we rebuild structures for organised collective action? Because I agree entirely with Tocqueville. If we don't have that ethos, if that's not part of our everyday life, there can be no democracy. If we don't know what organised collective action looks like, we're perforcedly privatised in how we live. And we have to do all of this with awareness, and I address this especially to those who are of the elites, that no amount of private wealth will protect us against the unravelling of social organisation that will occur in the context of catastrophe provoked by global warming. We need to practice difficult conversations with each other. The most difficult one, I believe, goes like this, and I have been practicing it, and it's really hard. I bet you know how hard it is too. What are we, that means you and me, going to do about global warming? How will we feel if we go to our grave knowing that we didn't do all we could in the face of likely catastrophe for those who are being born right now? We have to be able to tolerate confusion and uncertainty in these conversations, to know there's no quick fix, that we need to stay in the conversation, to keep it going, and to look for resources to develop and to improve it. We have to cultivate in ourselves, I think, the ethos of the Buddhist warrior, the virtues of patience, steadiness, steeliness, and above all, kindness, so that when we encounter the refusal to meet our demand for public conversation from current decision makers, we will not go away. That we stay until they're able to make some other kind of response. We also have to work out, those of us who are connected to them, how to support them in changing. We must hold people who misuse their power to shut down public conversation and to pursue private interests in publicly unaccountable ways to political account. And since such abuse includes the tactic of destroying the credibility of those who question it, we have to find ways of resisting that tactic, and also of being courageous in the face of being subject to it. We need to develop the capacity to become aware of and to respect different stakeholder perspectives, so that we do not turn our own perspective into the only one. I think we have to give up adversarial politics. It's critical that we do not demonise current decision makers, but rather that we invite them as fellow human beings who face very likely catastrophe into public conversation. And that we do this with awareness that it's not just them, it's all of us who are tempted to use different forms of retreat from the challenge of this conversation.